All right, today what I'm going to do is get started on some basics, like prerequisite knowledge for Algebra 2, and I'm going to jump back to even before pre-algebra, just getting into working with basic operations. And what we'll do is learn about how we add and subtract fractions, because it seems to be a constant sticking point with students. And before we start dealing with fractions, I want to talk about adding and subtracting things to begin with. And if we talk about adding and subtracting things, it'll help us with adding and subtracting fractions. And whenever I say adding and subtracting, sometimes I only use the word adding, sometimes I only use the word subtracting, but they're basically the same operations, so you treat them the same. And so when we're adding and subtracting things, you treat it the same way. And here's the example. Like I talk about adding and subtracting things. If you have, 4 cows plus 7 cows, what do you have? Most students will say 11. And I'm like, well, 11 what? And you have to think, well, I have 11 cows. You have to be specific. You're adding things, so you have to make sure you're working with the same things. And my example to lead into fractions, I start dealing with money. If you have 1 quarter and you're going to add to that 2 more quarters, what do you have? So again, some people will say I have 3, and I say, well, 3 what? And you have to say 3 quarters. So you have 3 quarters. You say, I have 3 quarters. So when we look at having 1 quarter and 2 quarters giving us 3 quarters, what we can do is say, well, what does that look like? Okay, so there's another way to write 1 quarter. 1 quarter is a fraction. It's 1 quarter. 2 quarters is also a fraction. It's 2 quarters. And when we add them together, we have 3 quarters. So we can add things that are like, and that's the only way it works. So people ask, well, what if I had 4 cows and I add to that, 3 apples? What do I have? And some people say 7. Well, 7 what? I'm adding and subtracting things. I have 7, I don't know. I can't add these. I can only add the same types of things. So when you're working with adding and subtracting, it's important to know that we are adding and subtracting things. And that will help us when we get into fractions. So take, for example, if I had 2/3 and I wanted to add to it 7/5, what do I have? Some people might say 9. Well, 9 what? 3/5? It doesn't exist. So we can't work with things like this. We have to be able to manipulate things so we have the same type of stuff, okay? So that's the concept of adding and subtracting things. Now we get into fractions. So in that first example, we have 2/3 and 5/7. Okay, and the way it works now, we cannot add thirds and sevenths. What we have to do is wonder, is there something I can change that 2/3 to? Can I change 2/3? Can I change 5/7? Can I change thirds into sevenths or sevenths into thirds? And no, you can't, because there's nothing you can do. However, what you can do is find a common denominator so you can make them the same thing. And the way you find the common denominator is wonder, if I have a 3 here and a 7 here, the denominator that would be common would be 21. I can multiply this denominator times this denominator, and I can multiply this denominator times this denominator, and I would end up with 21sts, 21s, okay? And I could add common 21s together. But I can't stop there. If I multiply a denominator by a certain number, I have to also multiply a numerator by that number, and the same thing applies for when I multiplied by 3. And so I can manipulate things to get common things. Now, unlike cows and apples, I can't manipulate an apple into a cow, and I can't manipulate a cow into an apple, but I can certainly manipulate numbers to get them to the common things. So at the top we have 2 times 7, which is 14 in the numerator, and 3 times 7 is 21 in the numerator. And I keep my sign there. 5 times 3 is 15. 7 times 3 is 21. And now look, I have common things, right? I have 14 21s and 15 21s, and I can add them. So as long as I have the same types of things, I can add them. They're both over 21. All I'm doing now is moving everything up to the top. Once I have the common thing that I'm working with, if I'm adding and subtracting common things, I keep my common thing, I move everything else to the top. So that, of course, will give me 29 21s, and that is fine by me. I have an improper fraction, I'm okay with it. And so that's how we can add fractions. So here's another example that deals with some more signs. So another example that deals with more signs, we've got -5/6 minus 1/8. And we can find the common denominator by multiplying these two things together. It'll give us 48. Okay, so 48, no doubt, is common. But there is a smaller common denominator between 6 and 8. And the smallest common denominator is 24. Because 8 can go into 24, and 6 can go into 24. So 24 is a smaller common denominator. Okay, so that's what we can manipulate. If I want to change 6 into a 24, I can multiply 6 times 3. 6 times 4. And if I wanted to change 8 into 24, I could multiply it by 3. And I would end up with two things over 24. But just like before, if I'm going to multiply the denominator by 4, I have to multiply the numerator by 4. And if I multiply the denominator by 3, I have to multiply the numerator by 3. Because I know 24 is a smaller denominator. So at the top, I'd have -20. For the denominator now, 24. My signs stay the same. 1 times 3 is 3. 8 times 3 is 24. And now I'm dealing with the same type of things. I can now subtract because they're both 24s. So I keep my denominator of 24. I move all of my signs to the top. That minus stays there. The 20 is there. This minus moves up. This 3 is there. And then I have everything at the top, and I can just manipulate that. So -20 minus 3 at the top is -23 over 24. And as long as I have like things, I can add or subtract, and that's how we can work with fractions. Thank you.